Welcome. Thank you everyone for coming tonight to hear Dr. Lea Rosson DeLong give a really lovely lecture about this fantastic exhibition that she very kindly guest curated for us here at University Museums. I wore black and white in honor of Lea, who is always perfectly chic in black and white. I probably don't look as chic, but that's okay, I try. There you go. I'm very happy to have this exhibition and to have worked with Lea, amazing art historian, and I learned so much just from talking to her about the artwork and picking her brain and just listening to how she thought about everything that she was choosing for this exhibition. And this exhibition is really important to us at University Museums because we really try to actively talk about the history of artists in Iowa and collect artists in Iowa, both contemporary and historical. And so to have this exhibition here and to be reopening the Brunnier with it, I think is very important to kind of culminate in all the work, especially Lynette and Lea have done together over the past 20 plus years. Lea's been a great friend and partner, and she's done so much work on Christian Peterson and the other artists of that period that we hold in our collection. And so we just owe so much to her. And so I want to say thank you for being here and doing all of this important work. And we'll send you to Scotland again to do some more writing. We seem to do that every year recently. And I also want to thank John and Kathy Howell, who very kindly donated the funds to create this lecture series throughout the year. And so we'll have many different lectures next semester, this semester that they are sponsoring. And we really appreciate that because it's important for us to educate because we're at a university. So we don't use art just to look at, we use it to educate with. And finally, I want to thank all the donors to this exhibition. It is a long list. I hope you are on there. Your name should be on there if you're a donor, but I'm not going to go through it now because that would take an hour and a half. But again, thank you so much, Lea, and I'm so happy to have you all here, and let's welcome Lea.
Good evening. Oh, yes, I am mic'd. Good. And I should say that if it appears that I've sprouted an antenna on my back, I have. It's the mic. So just ignore that particular part of my fashion statement. Okay. Good evening. I want to begin by asking you to be sure and read this panel in here at the beginning of the exhibition that lists the donors who contributed to the exhibition and or the publication of the book. Without the financial contributions of these patrons, we could achieve little. One of the strongest themes that has emerged from my study and research on this exhibition has been the importance of patronage. Art rises and falls, as I will say again. According to patronage, artists will create, no matter what, we know, but with support, they can contribute even more to our culture, and what they do create can be preserved. By patronage, now, I don't just mean buying art, although most of the objects in this exhibition could have been purchased for remarkably low prices. The patrons of artists are also those who are interested in art, who look at it and think about it. Patrons are people who are willing to be informed or challenged by an artist, or even sometimes who are willing to be changed by what they see when they contemplate a work of art. Now, I started to say, artists don't always affirm us or make us comfortable. None of these pictures up here that are in the exhibition are especially pleasant to look at. Sometimes artists ask us to consider things that make us uncomfortable, but which can lead to an enhanced understanding of ourselves, our fellow humans, and our society. As I have studied the art of Iowans, I have begun to be convinced also that it is important to apply that willingness to reconsider our values to nature and our impact on this environment here in Iowa. Iowans have a particular obligation to gauge our effect upon our lands, our soils, our water, and other living creatures, partly because of the unsurpassed beauty and fertility of the land that we have inherited. In Iowa, much has been lost. Much of our heritage, especially our artistic heritage, is gone and can never be restored to us. My research has made me acutely aware of all that has vanished, but it also made me aware of how much is still here. This exhibition is based in part on the first book of Iowa art history, which was called Iowa Artists of the First 100 Years, which was published in 1939 by Zenobia Ness, a faculty member at Iowa State, and Louise Orwig, both of them artists and arts administrators. They listed in 1939 over 800 artists known to have worked in Iowa during our first century. Most of these artists are forgotten, and it is difficult to find any information about them. In the entries for individual artists in the Ness and Orwig book, many of them list the exhibitions in which they participated and the awards they won. Today, few of those works of art can be found. The productivity of these Iowa citizens will likely never be known to us. On the screen, you have been looking at examples of works of art in this exhibition that were headed for the garbage before somebody rescued them. But they were not lost, and I have a feeling that if we start looking for artistic heritage, looking in museums and local libraries, county historical societies, private collections, we'll find others. I've often laughed about myself that I've made a career out of writing about artists that no one has ever heard of. In that case, for this exhibition, I hit the jackpot. Most of the artists here are ones that I knew little about and some I had never heard of. One conclusion I have made, and I hope you will share it, is that these artists should not be forgotten, but should be valued. Now, it's time to talk about history and how we know history. Who gets to write history? Before someone tries to discern patterns and assess significance and write down history, it is all a sequence of events whose meaning and import we may not be able to discern. Navigating these events and making sense of them is what historians do. A number of histories of Iowa have been written, but a survey of the art history of the state has not appeared. Ness and Orwig's book provided us with the raw materials of history, but they did not attempt to truly write a narrative history or to try to discern patterns or assess consequence, or assess significance or chronologies. This was the task that the university museums set for ourselves. Speaking for myself, it is one of the most difficult projects I've ever worked on. One of the main problems is that we were trying to record the history of something that hadn't been given much attention. In all these various histories of Iowa, art was often ignored. During the New Deal of the 1930s, the Federal Writers Project wrote guides to all the then 48 states. For the book Iowa, A Guide to the Hawkeye State, published in 1938, art and culture was literally at the back of the book. Here's the writer's account of art in Iowa. The homely richness of the Iowa scene, the geometric patterns of its cornfields, the barns and cattle and sturdy farmhouses has long sustained the pride and patriotism of the state. It is only during the last 20 years, however, and more particularly during the 1930s, so he's saying the last 8 years, that the well-known and well-loved homeland has been used as a subject matter for contemporary artists. And I may add, by the way, that Grant Wood was the major factor in making Iowa's subject matter acceptable, even to Iowans. So the guide goes on about art in Iowa. There was little time for artistic expression in the hard life of the early settlers, except in those products which served a useful as well as an aesthetic purpose. The example he gives is quilt making. He goes on, interest in handicraft, like quilt making, was acceptable, but anyone who had a talent and love for painting worked alone and as secretly as possible. He found no place in the methodical and hard-driving farm life, and more often than not was considered a bit queer or a lazy good-for-nothing. Well, such a situation is true of any pioneering society, and it is a truism of American art at its beginnings generally. Now, however accurate the assessment of artists in Iowa was in the past, that is no longer true. Without trying to discuss the art of Iowa in the post-World War II era, perhaps it is enough to point out that Iowa State University has the largest public art on campus program in the nation. Yes, it's here. And you may thank Lynette Pullman for it. In shaping this exhibition, I came to the conclusion that there were 3 issues or themes that I wanted to address. 1, 2, 3. Number 1, the Meskwaki ought to be included in the art history of Iowa. 2, the theme of the land itself, and usually love and reverence for the land, was central in Iowa art history. And 3, work, the rewards of work. Labor, especially agricultural labor, is almost always shown as worthwhile and successful, producing a stable and productive life. Work in Iowa works. If you work hard enough, your dreams will come true, especially if you put your faith and effort into the land. The reality is, even in Iowa, that isn't always true. Hard work doesn't get you anywhere often enough. Farms fail, businesses collapse, children go uneducated. Paradoxically, the harshness of life is not sidestepped in much of Iowa's literature. Novels about the state often deal with failure, disappointment, drudgery, suicide, poverty. But until the 1930s, I found no images of that in our art. I'm not saying they don't exist. I'm saying I couldn't find them. Let me comment here that I think that the concept of work and its inevitable rewards may partly be because for a great many people in Iowa, a life of satisfaction and stability, agrarian success, reliable production is not a myth. I think of one of the most important novels about pioneering Iowa and the generations that follow. It's called Vandermark's Folly, published in 1922, in which a young man journeys out to Iowa from New York in about 1855. He is penniless, and he's been oppressed and exploited for most of his young life. And when he gets to Iowa, he finds that the farm he purchased unseen is mostly a marsh, which is what the Iowa natural landscape was. Yet, through his own work and endurance and the occasional assistance of his friend, a Norwegian immigrant, he turns this land into a prosperous home for himself and for the generations of his family that follow him. One of the objects in this exhibition, this one, the portrait of Benjamin F. Gway, is a portrait of one of the early politicians and historians of Iowa, painted by his brother, John David. Also on view in the exhibition is his diary, in which he records when he and his brother left New York for Iowa in 1852. Now remember, Iowa became a state in 1846. Benjamin Gway was instrumental in Iowa accepting the Morrill Act for the establishment of a land-grant college, which, as you know, is Iowa State University. He was also the person, as I've noted, who insisted that this new college admit women. The works of art in this exhibition tell us this Iowa story of what the land was before it was settled, how it came under cultivation, the successes and conflicts that arose on and from that land, and what people believed to be important and worth recording and worth remembering. To detail these themes, let's start, as I mentioned earlier, with the Meskwaki. Known as the Sac and Fox tribe of the Mississippi and Iowa, they are the only federally recognized tribal group in Iowa. By the late 18th century, they were established in Iowa. As those prairie lands began to be settled by Euro-Americans, the Meskwakis were pushed further west. They ceded land again and again, and were finally, by 1845, placed on reservations in Kansas and Oklahoma. Now, their history is complex, but the important occurrence for this study is their 1857 decision to buy back a portion of their land and establish what is known as the Meskwaki settlement in Tama. It was not ever and is not now a reservation. In 1857, I didn't realize this, the tribe had to petition the Iowa legislature for the right to buy land and to be recognized as citizens of the state. I didn't realize for a long time either that it was not until 1924 that Native Americans were generally affirmed as citizens of the United States. As to the role of the Meskwaki or any tribal groups in the history of Iowa art, here's the assessment of the 1938 guide. Quote, "The first art was, of course, that of the mound builders and Indians, but it is a thing apart and has had little or no influence." I believe that's accurate. It is one of the situations that our exhibition and book attempts to address. Now, here is the most astounding, and I shouldn't say, but I will, most valuable works of art in the exhibition. Waukeshashi. was a chief who gave this drawing to his friend, Colonel George Davenport, the founder of Davenport, Iowa. Some of Davenport's possessions descended in his family and were given to the State Historical Museum by his daughter in 1924. In 1973, this two-section drawing was found tucked between the pages of a large book on the history of Native Americans. Its importance was immediately recognized. It is today regarded as among the most important works of Native American art, period. The drawing is nearly vibrating with animals, humans, natural features of every description, from massive buffalo to turtles lined up on a log and even insects. Waukeshashi gives us a range of natural life in a pristine environment. This was dated 1830, approximately 1830. Iowa became a state in 1846. It's a pristine environment that he shows us, an environment that is now nearly erased or remains only as a remnant. The abundance of this land seems to fill Waukeshashi with joy and reverence at the same time that he recognizes its dangers, as in the buffalo hunt or in his own conflicts with humans. Now, bringing my antenna along with me, you can see here's the buffalo hunt. Here's his name. These two, that area right there has his name. Here he is in a conflict with an enemy in which he shoots somebody with a gun. Now down here, he can shoot somebody with an arrow too. Here's the turtles lined up on a log. And here, he's showing himself as a fisherman. Here, this little tree, Juan Miro and Paul Klee in the 20th century couldn't equal anything as elegant as this tree with the little squirrel scampering up around it. And you can just, now, while I'm here, you see these jagged lightning-like lines? Okay, look at how they're all going from the animals to Waukeshashi. And these are portraits of him and what he is doing in the landscape of Iowa. Oh, I wanted to show you this, if I can get this to focus. See this little figure right here? When you go back and look at the picture, I think it's a little prairie dog. And the reason I think it is because there's a line just below him where you can see his burrow. And it's remarkable how Waukeshashi can really describe the natural life of Iowa in this drawing. So Waukeshashi here gives us a range of natural life in a pristine environment, an environment that, as I already said that, now erased or remains only as a remnant. He shows us how connected he feels to this natural world by the jagged lines that flow from various animals to him, especially as he defends himself against an enemy. These jagged lines symbolize the transference or perhaps the sharing of sacred power between the animals and Waukeshashi. The best description of this importance of this picture is written by Gaylord Torrance in one of his many studies of Meskwaki art. And Gaylord Torrance, the senior curator of American Indian art at the Nelson Atkins Museum, will be here tomorrow at the symposium. He has written about this drawing. Waukeshashi has conveyed much more than an assembly of animals and a record of personal experience. He has evoked for us an image of Iowa as a place that we will never fully know. A dynamic world whose pale outlines are barely visible today, an open land of wild rolling prairie, dense forests, and unrestricted rivers, all inhabited by an abundance of living creatures who shared their world with the Meskwaki. This drawing is the earliest known representation in the state of Iowa of a love and reverence for the land, a feeling that blends into spiritual connections with it. In the exhibition, I installed the Waukeshashi drawing at the beginning, and I felt that this woodcut by Dorothy Szabo was an appropriate end statement for the exhibition. Obviously, both are black and white, but beyond that, I found that they had in common a love and reverence for the land and for the processes of nature that exist beyond human control. Nature is having an existence on its own, apart from anything humans do or don't do. To some degree, it is a bleak scene that borders on ruin, and yet, I find it vividly alive, nearly vibrating with some unseen power. I see it as a winter scene when nature may appear on the surface to be dead, but nature's forces and energies, as she calls it, are only submerged, not dead at all. Above the trees is a celestial body, either the sun or the full moon, which adds an animating force to this vision of nature. The artistic traditions of the Meskwaki continued into the 20th century, as we see in this spoon by an artist from the Meskwaki settlement, John Youngbear. He has made of this ordinary object, it's a spoon, an ceremonial and meaningful work of art. The bowl of the spoon has been carved and burnished to a delicate thinness in which its grain is displayed in its particular kind of beauty. For the Meskwaki, trees are sacred, and objects made from their wood continue to carry some of the life force of the tree. Though small, the spoon is full of intensity, which rewards our examination. Arising from the bowl, still within a single piece of wood, the handle lifts off and is transformed into the neck of a horse. At the end of the handle, the artist has fashioned a horse's head with a minimum of incisions and additions. A physically small addition, but one that imbues this sculpture with a strong sense of presence, are two tiny nail heads inserted to represent eyes. As they catch the light, they alter the character of this object so that the horse now seems to possess a penetrating stare, as if emanating from a spiritual source. You'll want to look at it more closely later on. Here is a work by Adeline Juana T. The most recent object by a Meskwaki artist is this sash. It is the only work of abstract art in the exhibition. Juana T uses a traditional pattern known as an arrow or arrowhead design. It seems to be related to those jagged lightning-like lines used by Wakashashi to represent the imparting of power and connection. A graduate of the Haskell Indian Nations University at Lawrence, Kansas, Juana T became an important figure as she advocated for the right of Native children to be educated within their own culture, the preservation of the Meskwaki language, and many other causes. In addition, she was important for women's rights and for integrating women into tribal governance. She was the first woman to serve on the Meskwaki annual powwow associations and other distinctions. And Adeline Juana T is the only Native American woman in the Iowa Women's Hall of Fame. Now, it's going to take up a minute, but I had to put this in. Before moving into other aspects of the exhibition, I must read one of the most interesting statements and historical incidents which I encountered in my research. It comes from Keokuk, a Meskwaki chief who was involved in the treaties in which the tribe ceded lands as they were pushed continually westward. At one point, when the tribe still lived in Iowa, it was reported that Keokuk had heard that some of the white settlers were spreading rumors and writing in their newspapers that the Meskwaki were getting restive. So Keokuk wrote to a newspaper to quell those rumors and assure the white settlers that they had nothing to fear. And I'll read this entire statement, part of which you see there. I do not permit the criers of our villages to proclaim any bad news against the whites, not even the truth. If a white man comes to our village, we give him a share of what we have to eat, a lodging if he wants it, and we put him back on the trail if he has lost it. Advise the criers of your villages to tell the truth respecting us and assist in strengthening the chain of friendship, that your children may treat us friendly when they meet us, and be assured that we are friends and have feelings as well as they have. Most of the artists of Iowa have come out of the European tradition, and it is to that stream of art history that we now turn in the works of John Casper Wilde. His paintings and prints are the earliest recordings of the towns along the Mississippi. He depicts Iowa in the process of transformation from a wilderness of farm fields and frontier cities. But his life was difficult because he had a constant struggle for patronage for his art. He was born in Switzerland, trained in Paris, and brought his considerable skills first to Philadelphia, but he left. It was reported because of the coldness of his reception. He headed west and established himself in St. Louis, where he made some of the earliest and most famous images of that frontier community. In 1844, 2 years before we became a state, he moved northward on the Mississippi to the young communities of Davenport, Muscatine, Dubuque, and others. In his lithograph of Dubuque, is this showing up? If you can see, and you can see when you look, there's a little tiny, tiny figure right there. It's an artist sketching. He pictured an artist perched on a hillside, drawing the developing society around him. It was his way of asserting the importance of artists who document and give meaning to the transformations in society. Were it not for Wilde, how would we know what these early communities and their surrounding landscape looked like? But his life was a continual struggle to earn a living from his art. An early historian in Davenport recalled his impression of Wilde in a way that reminds us of how difficult the lives of artists in Iowa have sometimes been. He wrote about John Casper Wilde. He had a worn and haggard look, the result doubtless of ill health and a lifelong battle with the world for the bare means of subsistence. He looked tragedy, thought tragedy, and his conversation outside of art was never much more cheerful than tragedy. Wilde died in Davenport when he was only 42, and his paintings and prints had to be sold to settle his debts. He was forgotten. When Ness and Orwig compiled their book in 1939, he was not in it. Fortunately, the State Historical Museum and a few others retained his pictures, and today he has been rediscovered and recognized. And here is John Henry Newell, among the earliest Iowa artists to be recognized as an artist. He was brought by his mother to Iowa City as a teenager in about 1843. He had the remarkable and very unusual good fortune to be recognized as a person of talent and potential by a judge of the Iowa Supreme Court. Realizing that the young Newell could find no training here as an artist, he gathered the funds to send him to New York to study at the National Academy of Design. From there, Newell went to Europe, where he lived for considerable periods when he wasn't working in New York. He gained a significant reputation as a painter there and in Europe, and he never returned to Iowa. A common enough occurrence. However, he did spend a short period just after his first years of study in New York on a visit back to his hometown of Iowa City. And he left us some of the earliest and most skilled recordings of the town. A sketchbook from 1854-55 has been preserved and protected in the special collections at the University of Iowa Library, and we are grateful that they allowed us to exhibit two of his drawings. The buildings of Iowa City can be seen along the horizon of Newell's drawings, but he also makes us aware of the natural landscape and the transformation it is undergoing as the prairies are drained and the woodlands are cleared for the cultivation of crops. In one of the drawings, he depicts a pure landscape, this drawing one here, and we're going to look at that tree stump there. The dominant feature is that tree stump. Tree stumps are often found in American landscape paintings to remind us of the forests that had formerly covered much of the continent and which were, even in Newell's lifetime, being drastically reduced. The tree stump represents a dichotomy in American culture: regret that these vast forests had to be sacrificed for settlement, but pride in bringing the land under cultivation. If our landscape paintings contain any human figures, they are usually small, as they are here. And they're so small that you can't probably even see them right now, but when you look at the drawings, you'll be able to make them out. They're small. This kind of image can be recognized, can be read as a recognition of our smallness in the enormity of nature, and also as a sense of conquering what had been a difficult and dangerous wilderness. As Iowa moved beyond the pioneering period of our history, cultural life shifted as well. If a young person wanted to become an artist, they nearly always left the state for their training. According to Ness and Orwig, most of them went to the Art Institute of Chicago. Sometimes they headed further east to New York, and even a few of them went to Europe, especially France. Many of these artists painted subjects that reflected their artistic sophistication, and often enough, European or American East Coast scenes, and these are represented in the exhibition. But some of them painted Iowa. Leela Briggs. Her great-grandfather had been a pioneer who founded the small town of Powersville. In her mid-century watercolor, she depicts an agrarian vision of Iowa that has endured into contemporary times. This is the house that her grandfather built, a house that since his homesteading in the 19th century has become and remained the center of a satisfying, productive life for generations of Iowans. Suffused with a golden light, The scene contains a large and comfortable farmhouse, red outbuildings, and livestock. It is surrounded by an aura of agricultural abundance. It represents the promise of Iowa for thousands of immigrants who journeyed here, settled here, in search of a different and better way of life. Prosperity and peacefulness, all the aspirations of those early pioneers are realized in this harmonious and untroubled scene. Briggs would have witnessed hard times on Iowa farms, but she does not hint of it here. This idealized concept of rural and small town life is still revered by many Iowans, and that is so because, for some, it is based in reality. Briggs recorded an Iowa that did exist, not for everyone, but for enough that it has become ingrained in the character and self-concept of the state. What is also integral to this vision of Iowa is the belief that hard work will be rewarded and will lead to success. It isn't always true, not then and not now, but it's true enough for enough people that it is also woven into the self-concept of the state. Here's Ding Darling. The images that perhaps best capture the hope of those who came to settle Iowa are these by Ding Darling, a newspaper editorial cartoonist better known today as one of the most effective advocates for environmental protections in American history. He instituted the duck stamp program. A lone family in both etchings has stopped their covered wagon to gaze at the unsettled, uncultivated, pristine landscape before them. They seem awed by the prospect of this land of Iowa. Land, trees, water, wildlife, everything is there from which to make a new life. All the possibilities that would drive a person to a new place are embodied in Darling's view of early Iowa. And for many of these settlers, their dreams did come true. The scene reminds me of a description of Iowa that was written in 1855 as an inducement to immigrants to make their way out to the new state. And it went in part. Iowa holds out inducements such as no other state can boast. Her resources are inexhaustible. Her advantages are beyond the scope of calculation. And her claims upon the person who is energetic, industrious, and ambitious are vast. Well, for many people who came to Iowa, these exclamations proved to be true, but not for all and not forever. The 20th century brought the most serious economic crisis in the nation's history, and Iowa suffered along with the rest of the country in the Great Depression. Yet the state of Iowa was also in a period of flowering of art in the 1930s. I don't even need to say. This burst of creativity arose, I say, from two factors. One was the presence and influence of Grant Wood, who may have been, probably was, the most famous artist in America in the 1930s, although he was not universally admired. He was a spokesperson for regionalism, a style that was highly important and practiced in American art in the Great Depression, and he painted the most famous painting in American history. The second factor was the New Deal art programs. Second factor in the flowering of Iowa art in the 1930s, which, for the first time, provided national patronage for artists in every state of the country. The first arts agency of the New Deal was the Public Works of Art Project, the PWAP, and Grant Wood was the state director of the project for Iowa. In that capacity, he tried very hard to support as many artists as possible by hiring them to create works of art for the citizens of Iowa. He directed the mural cycle at the Iowa State University Library, which I hope you have seen, a mural cycle called When Tillage Begins, Other Arts Follow, and he hired Christian Peterson for the PWAP. When Congress defunded the PWAP after only about 4 months, Peterson's project, a sculptural installation, The History of Dairying, which is what you see at the top there, was not finished. Of course not, 4 months. So the president of Iowa State hired Christian Peterson to come here to this campus in 1934 as the first artist in residence at an American college. Yes, that was Iowa State. Wood is by far the most important figure in the history of artists in Iowa. There has been no one like him before or since. Yet, inspired partly by his desire to increase the recognition of other artists in Iowa, Wood is not the focus of this exhibition. He's represented by only 4 objects, but each of them has an important statement to make about life here in our state. Today, I am only going to discuss one of these works, and that's this lithograph in the spring, because it is one of the best examples ever, I think, of Iowa as an agricultural paradise in which the hopes and dreams of common people have been realized. They have used the opportunity provided by the soils and resources of Iowa to bring prosperity, stability, and order to their own lives and the lives of generations who have followed them. In the Spring depicts an ideal Iowa landscape brimming with agrarian success and happiness. Look at the beautifully cultivated fields, the fine barn and silo, even the cows are in a stately procession along the fence row. But the most important thing is the farmer, pausing for a moment in his work to turn toward the viewer, of whom he is clearly aware. The most important thing about the farmer, I think, he's smiling. He's just an ordinary farmer wearing overalls, the uniform of rural labor, standing on his own land that he has worked and which has rewarded him. He is full of pride, in control of his corner of the world and of his destiny, a happy man whose dreams have come true. Other Iowa images of the time followed Wood's lead and perpetuated the idea of an agricultural dream come true, a land of reliable productivity in which one's labor reaped benefits for every aspect of life, not just crop yields. But other artists of that time in Iowa were not so willing to overlook the hard times, and they have left us a record of the troubles suffered by Iowans. This is just one. By Lynn Nelson Stacy, called Dole. One of the most affecting and accurate as to the emotional tenor of the times is this painting. A sober and defeated man sits dejected in a chair, a person who's lost his job and his means of making a living. The painting contains 2 Depression-era symbols of his situation. One is the empty, upturned, idle hand in his lap. Nothing to do. The other is the nearby newspaper, which is where the unemployed relentlessly scan the want ads looking for work. Behind him is a lightly painted specter-like image of people lining up beneath a sign for Emergency Relief Committee. This sort of public humiliation may soon be happening to him. His back is turned away from these people, but even in his stare of hopelessness and depression, he seems to sense their presence, a haunting reminder of what might be his future. Iowa wasn't any better off than the other parts of the country, as the Depression strangled the economy in the 1930s. Charities, such as the Emergency Relief Committee, tried to address the needs of the population, but the scale was beyond them. When the New Deal came in after Roosevelt's election in 1932, the government began to remedy the desperate situation of millions of Americans. Yet, applying for that relief was embarrassing. Admitting that you needed help was a public admission of failure, many felt. That is why Stacy entitled his painting Dole, which was a common term during the Depression. Today we would call it welfare. To go on the dole during Stacy's time was something people dreaded, but which they accepted because their need was great. Other artists in the exhibition admitted in their art that life in Iowa was not always perfect, that productivity had declined, that poverty and isolation did exist, even on the rich soil of Iowa. I've only scratched the surface of what might be said about artists in Iowa, the first century. There's so much more that we could and we should talk about and recognize, but we'd be here till 10, and that's not what we're interested in, right? Right. I thought so. I encourage you to attend the symposium tomorrow, even if you can only come for an hour or so. The speakers, which include art historians like Joni Kinsey at the University of Iowa and Mara Lyons from Drake University, as well as other authorities, will be giving talks and participating in panel discussions, including some tribal members from the Meskwaki settlement. I expect to learn a great deal from all of them, and so would all of us. I end with two pictures that are among my personal favorites. This is Francis McCray, Young Corn, 1944. I regard McCray's Young Corn so highly, not only because it is so skillfully executed, but because of what it says about Iowa and about reverence for the land. This is the third time I have placed this drawing into an exhibition I curated because I feel it is such a significant image. It offers an intense close-up look at an Iowa farmer holding a little corn plant in his hand. He's plain-faced and serious with work-worn hands, which nevertheless tenderly hold and cradle the sprouting plant like something precious. I once compared him to a priest holding the sacrament. We could read this image as a metaphor of life in America, but we can also see it in a literal, realistic, down-to-earth way, not a metaphor at all. This man is holding, showing off, treasuring the thing on which his life is based. He has planted his corn crop in the expectation that it will grow, be harvested, and continue to sustain him and his way of life. McCray places his farmer well into the foreground, in the frontal plane of the picture, so that we see him clearly as a quiet but self-possessed and compelling figure, giving us instruction and showing us something vital and fundamental to our being. The artist places this farmer against a two-point perspective of a planted field. And see how all the lines on this side go here, and all the lines on this side go here. So that's a two-point perspective. That's what I mean by that. They lead to two things, the telephone pole and the church. The telephone pole might represent the gains made in Iowa's rural life through agencies such as the rural electrification programs of the New Deal, but it also resembles a cross or a crucifix, doesn't it? Perhaps to symbolize the sacrifices demanded by the land or the redemption and salvation brought about by hard work. The church, on the other side, is an example of the plain vernacular architecture that dots the Iowa countryside. However, I do not think of it as just a pedestrian symbol of religion, such as the farmer having faith that God will make his crops grow, but instead is a deeper insight and comment about the spirituality that has its source in a sense of connection with the land and with nature. In that regard, it might be seen as the white culture's version of the ideas in Wakashashi's early Iowa landscape. The Native American attitude towards nature and land use is different from that of the white culture. In Indian life, as it was lived prior to contact, the ecosystem was little disturbed, rarely was it permanently altered, and it was generally self-sustaining and self-renewing. For the pioneering settlers of Iowa, however, this attitude towards the land was just simply unacceptable. We often read in 19th century documents that, in their opinion, the native cultures were simply wasting the land, not putting it to use. The white settlers put it to use, clearing forests, draining wetlands, plowing the virgin prairies. A remarkable civilization did grow up here, and its bounty seems boundless. But is it flawless? Is it eternal? As we read in the 1855 essay encouraging the settlement of Iowa, her resources are inexhaustible. Is that true? Now about artists. Finally, I'd like to end with this one, Alma Held's Self-Portrait. Undated, but probably from the 1920s or possibly the 1930s. This painting suggests to me the determination of certain Iowans to be artists, even though the odds were against them. They weren't held in high regard by their neighbors, and they enjoyed little patronage. This portrait is harsh, even abrasive, confrontational, with the artist staring at herself in the mirror at the same time that her reflection is pointed out towards us, the viewers. We know she is an artist because she records herself at her canvas, brushes in hand. Held was a highly trained artist, including study in New York at the National Academy of Design. Yet her painting has such an unvarnished quality, almost a folk-like tone, as if she isn't placing any filters between herself and the mirror or us as her viewers. Over half of the artists in the Ness and Orwig book are women. And it's interesting to see how assiduously they try to train themselves, study, create, and have a life as an artist. Not all were successful. Held presents herself as an ordinary woman of the people. She's clean and neat. Her hair's carefully coiffed, wearing a sweetly colored feminine blouse with a tidy bow at the neckline. She also shows herself in a crisp, white, carefully tailored apron or pinafore, what one wears when cooking or cleaning. So she's familiar with the cliches about women and about artists. Judging only by her appearance, we might think she's a farm wife painting in her kitchen or a small-town school teacher. But look at her demeanor. She looks directly outward without a hint of a smile. She makes her point that she is not to be dismissed. She is serious, and her identity as an artist is secure, no matter what you might think. This portrait and the messages it contained about not only women, but about artists and about the determination to be an artist, make it, to me, one of the most compelling works of art in the exhibition. My final comment tonight is about artists in Iowa, in the past and today. It's sort of repetitive, but I'm going to say it again. Artists have always been here, but we have to recognize them. As I said, art rises and falls largely because of patronage. Artists will create, you can't stop them, no matter what. But if they are well regarded and supported by their own culture, they will be even more productive and their work will be preserved. Again, patronage doesn't just mean buying art. It means looking at art, thinking about it, being willing to be informed by it, and sometimes even being changed by it. Tonight in this room, we are patrons of artists in Iowa. Now, when I began my research on artists in Iowa, it was a long time ago. And some of the people whose works are in the exhibition were still alive. And I talked to them and I knew them. Sometimes I think about those artists. They're all gone now. And about the other artists in the exhibition. And sometimes when I walk into these rooms, I'm very moved because I think about those artists and what struggles so many of them had. And I think how they'd feel to come into this room and to see their works of art. They're still here. They're on display. They're kept safe. And look, also, they're being contemplated by you. So thank you. Thank you for being here and for being patrons.